You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Shawn Wilkie, and along with my awesome co-host, we interview the innovators in this space every week. Super excited about today's guest. Ivan, please go ahead and get us started.
Hey, I'm Ivan Zach. Very excited to introduce Jeff Barnes. Jeff has been in the medical device industry for over 30 years. He's a president at Aimalojic Animal Health. In the 90s, Jeff was subject matter expert and surgical technician for the companies that developed and commercialized LASIK surgery and femtosecond laser cataract surgery. In 2012, Jeff co-founded startup Immutrix Therapeutics. Jeff is one of the faculty with the IRIS International Renal Interest Society Veterinary Hemodialysis Academy, where he lectures on advancement in hemoperfusion. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for finding the time.
My pleasure.
And Jeff, thanks for inserting all of these very difficult words for Ivan to read during the introduction. I love that. It's awesome.
My pleasure.
It's good to have you here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll give you that, Shawn, next time you're reading these. So very interesting. So you had a long career in the device industry, and then you were in healthcare, and then you switched to veterinary. So what prompted you to do that? How did you end up in our domain? And what's happening with your new company here?
Well, we started, as you mentioned, we started in 2012 with an idea kind of on a napkin, and it came through personal experience with my sister. And ultimately, we kind of stumbled on this idea, this technology. And as we pursued it in human health, we discovered that there was a huge unmet need in veterinary medicine. That was about 4 years ago that we kind of stumbled into it. So I wouldn't say that we set out to be in the veterinary space, but it found us. And it's been, after 25 plus years in medical device on the human side, I can tell you I've enjoyed the past 4 years on the veterinary side more than I ever did the human side. So I'm really happy to be in the space and be working with some really great folks.
So what is that? Can you tell us a little more about the company and what do you guys do?
So we have a blood filter. So we take blood outside the body, we do something to it, we purify it, and we return it to the patient. So it's similar to hemodialysis, but we do things that hemodialysis can't do, and hemodialysis does things that we can't do. So we kind of complement each other in terms of therapies. The things that we can take out of blood, we want to take bad things out of blood, and we don't want to take good things out of blood. So the bad things could be drugs or poisons or envenomation. It could be toxins of any kind, really, that fit into a specific category. But it can also be other things that your body produces. So those would be things like inflammatory cytokines, things that are associated with many different disease conditions, or acute kidney injury, or lots of different things can cause this. But it becomes a runaway freight train of inflammatory response. It's the same thing that kills COVID patients, is that inflammatory response. And so if you can modulate or regulate those things that are dysregulated by removing them, oftentimes then other therapies can be delivered, and you can have a successful outcome instead of a bad outcome.
That makes sense. From practical standpoint, I remember, I was always fascinated with the hemodialysis and what it does already in the human patients. But this was, when I was practicing veterinarian, which is just 6 years ago, it's not an easily accessible equipment that you can have. And if we're talking about the toxicities and acute onset or something, that's usually emergency hospital. And the way we dealt with it is you really contact the toxicologist through the helpline, and then they will kind of, respond with a treatment plan and things like that. If your invention and innovation was available commercially today, how would that visit look like if someone knows the toxicity or suspects toxicity at the top differential diagnosis?
So typically the patients that we see, that we've treated, are really severe. And they're typically known what the toxicity is. They don't always know the dose. But normally the patients that we treat are in a coma, possibly in need of ventilation. It's pretty obvious that these guys are really sick. Because of where we're at right now, we're in the centers that have hemodialysis. And in the United States, I believe there's only 30. So there's only 30 hospitals. Most of those are in academic settings. So it's pretty rare that, an animal goes to the emergency hospital and then they know that dialysis is a good, or a dialysis-like treatment is a good option, and then they get referred, and then we treat them. The delivery system, you're exactly right. The equipment is very complex. It's very expensive. That's why it doesn't really exist in veterinary medicine. We are making a delivery system. We'll have it available the first part of the year. We've been working on it for a long time. We've gone through a lot of generations, and the latest one is ready for production. We've gone through all of the regulatory hurdles and everything else, and it's ready. So now any veterinary hospital could acquire this, and this is kind of knuckle dragger stuff compared to hemodialysis. Dialysis, you need to be a physicist, a chemist, on top of being a clinician. It's a very complicated therapy to administer, where this hemoperfusion is really you put a catheter in and you hit go, and it just pumps the blood through this this activated carbon filter.
That's super fascinating, Jeff. So help me kind of understand how you got here. So what was that origin story on the back of the napkin, and kind of what's the next 6 months look like for you guys as a company?
I'll try to make a long story very short, but this came about through an experience with my family. My sister was diagnosed with glioblastoma and given 6 months to live. And she was living in New York at the time, and at NYU, they told her that chemo and radiation was her only option. And she said, well, I'm not doing it. If I got 6 months to live, I'm not going to be sick for 6 months. And my mom, who has also been in biotech her whole career, just reached out to some contacts and ultimately led us to a physician a neurologist in Stockholm, Sweden, which took my sister as a patient and did this microsurgery on her brain and removed this tumor from the top of her spinal column. And then he recommended, the surgery went great. She came out just as she went in, speaking 7 languages. He recommended then we go to Austria for transfusion, for plasma replacement. He said, we're not exactly sure why this works, but it seems to help in the recovery of these patients. And so we did. So we went to Austria, and she had her plasma perfused or replaced several times. And she lived for another 7 years with perfect quality of life. And during that time, we had met these researchers from around the globe. This doctor in Austria, this doctor in Sweden, this professor at the Texas Tech University, and none of them knew each other. And so we put them in a room and said, you guys are all telling us that this works, that there's something to this, help us understand what this is. And we came up with a strategy to do a little research, which we did at Texas Tech, to understand what exactly is happening when you replace somebody's plasma. What are you taking out that's bad? And you're replacing it with donor plasma. Could we do the same thing with a filter? And as we look into this, there's a long history. This goes back to the 40s, that this idea has been around forever. In fact, it goes, if you really want to stretch it a little bit, it goes back to bloodletting. You have a toxin built up in your body, and if you cut yourself and bleed out just enough, not too much, but if you bleed out enough, you're going to get rid of some of that toxin. And so this plasma exchange is the same concept, or hemoperfusion. Well, over time, what they discovered is that blood really doesn't like to be outside the body. And it certainly doesn't like things that aren't the inside of your organs and the inside of your vessels. And it responds. And it responds in very negative ways, clotting, all those kinds of things. But also, you got other factors that respond in terms of, your white cells respond, you get inflammatory response. But then when you're filtering, if you don't have the right filter, you start taking away things that the body needs, like calcium and glucose and potassium, and there's hormones, there's all kinds of things in blood that you don't want to mess with. And back in the day, in the 70s, they started using charcoal for the filter, which would remove everything, just like it does when you purify water with activated charcoal. So they tried it, and it's kind of started to take off in the 1980s. Even though it had its drawbacks, they had figured little ways around that, and then it just died in the 90s. And that was really a result of they didn't have the right mousetrap, and also at the same time, hemodialysis technology got better and better and better, and leaps and bounds better. And so hemoperfusion just kind of died on the vine. So that's what we discovered. We discovered that the idea had already been out there, but they didn't have the right mousetrap. And we found one that was made by a company in England. It was an activated carbon made synthetically. And so we entered into a joint venture with them. And, I guess here we are 10 years later, and we're manufacturing that carbon here in South Dakota now.
Wow. That's awesome. So now, this quite the journey, an amazing origin story. What's the next quarter or the next couple of quarters look like for Vet Health for what you guys have come up with?
We're finally, a couple of things have set us back. We should have been where we are today 2 years ago. And a couple things, one of which is always in a startup medical device world is always funding is an issue. We're privately funded. So, having sort of a stop-start cycle when you're in going from R&D into full production and trying to build up your ability to manufacture. We're finally kind of over that hurdle. We're ready to make stuff, and we are making stuff and selling it. And then, of course, COVID hit, and supply chain issues, labor issues, not only for us, but our research partners and our suppliers. So that has kind of set us back, but we're kind of got all the wheels turning again. We are going to IVEX next week, the critical care meeting in Nashville. It's in person this year. We're real excited to go. The last time we went was in 2019, and the response we got was just overwhelming. People come up and this just has not ever existed in veterinary medicine before. And so people come up and they kind of scratch their head and go, "What do you do?" So, well, we filter blood. We can take drugs, in an intoxication. We can take drugs out of a, massive overdose in less than an hour, and with no side effects, no long-term effects. And we're like, wow, okay. So we're looking forward to doing that again, but we're so much closer to launch. We'll have product ready to go. We do have product ready to go with the filters for those people that have access to hemodialysis equipment. But if you don't have access to hemodialysis equipment, we'll have that equipment available by probably February.
So I just want to say that this is probably one of the most fascinating stories of the origin of the company that we heard here. And just incredible story about, your sister, and just very, very empowering and interesting how you converted the situation in your family into this innovation. So just kudos to you for that. So one thing that you said, and this is sort of, I kept it circling in my head every time I'm talking to someone who is so related to the human healthcare, because all the approvals and, and FDs and everything that needs to go through in human health is much harder than in veterinary. And I keep thinking that shouldn't this be like a standard path from software to medical devices to anything else to try guinea pigs first, and literally guinea pigs in the veterinary medicine. And then once it goes through a certain trial and error in the veterinary medicine, progress into licensing. And the path is, if it's very well outlined on like what steps do you take in veterinary and how do you then progress to human, I think that would cut back on funding significantly. So is that the goal, or is that the path you chose, or you just kind of stumbled upon it?
We really did stumble upon it. We looked at the veterinary opportunity many, many years ago, probably right after we got started. We thought, this would be great in veterinary medicine. And then we discovered nobody even knows what this is in veterinary medicine. And we were told by a group of veterinarians that, it'll never work. We don't have the training. We don't have the equipment. It probably would cost too much. I mean, all these things that they told us. And we said, oh, okay, well, we'll just keep doing what we kind of set out to do. And then fast forward, and I met a group, and I was at a nephrology meeting, and I met a veterinary nephrologist who gave this lecture. He was on this panel of experts, and he gave this lecture on therapeutic plasma exchange. And I went up to him afterwards, and I told him what we were doing. And literally what he said is, "Where have you been for the last 30 years of my life?" And so in working with him, we discovered that there was this opportunity, and it completely changed the course of our business, I think for the better, because instead of trying to jump over that huge hurdle, it gives you a couple of different opportunities to step up and really perfect your technology and your manufacturing and all the things that you need to do, plus your regulatory requirements, which, by the way, are the same for veterinary medicine as they are human medicine. It really is, it's kind of like a dress rehearsal. So it's been really, we've been fortunate for that reason.
Jeff, I'm sure a lot of our listeners can relate to kind of the question I'm going to ask next. And I'm really interested to double click on it because you said you were super excited to be in vet med. And it's like you kind of alluded to this like less friction compared to the human medical device world. Can you just double click on that for us and help us understand like why you're excited to be in vet med and maybe how painful it might be, or compare and contrast between the two industries a little bit for us?
Having been in human medicine, medical device for so long, and a lot of great people in that space, but it's a very competitive environment. It tends to attract, I don't know what the word really is, but it's a much different culture than the culture on the veterinary side, both in the clinics and in the industry. Going to these trade shows and talking to people, that's all I can explain. It's a different culture, and I really like it. That's one. The other is the ability to innovate. For us, I'm working with just an example. I'm working with a veterinary nephrologist who came up with an idea. When we look at a model for systemic inflammation, like sepsis, right? Sepsis is this runaway freight train of pro-inflammatory cytokines that ultimately you die of multiple organ failure. It's a really difficult model to study because the cause, the pathophysiology of the disease could be so different from one patient to the next. And the actual disease itself is very different from one patient to the next. And so trying to study a population like this is very complicated. And he suggested, why not use heat stroke as a really good model for inflammatory response, where virtually all the patients they come in the same. So if we categorize severe heat stroke with these parameters and we treat those patients, we can easily study and have a control group. And so we're doing that. And the ability to do that, to just pivot like literally in a matter of weeks and say, oh, okay, now we're doing a heat stroke study. That is super fun for us. You don't get to do that in human medicine. It's years of planning to get a trial underway if you want to go for a new indication.
And with all the compliments to our industry, I'm also disappointed sometimes because when you talk to a veterinarian, you're talking to a veterinarian. That veterinarian represents the industry to you. So years back, whoever you talked to, that person wasn't innovative. And now that you bumped into this nephrologist, and then this took sort of grassroots and progressing. It's interesting because veterinarians are quite laggards when it comes to technology. So it's interesting. Depends who you talk to. But I'm glad that you found the right connections, and this now has a life on its own. When people want to find out about you, about the device, about the functionality, where they can find you and learn about you other than IVEX, because this might come out after IVEX. So where would people learn more about what you do?
There's not really a lot of information. We've been very good at doing research and doing a lot of things, but our marketing efforts have been kind of just backburnered for a long time, and we're just starting to do that. So our website is Aimalojic. That's A-I-M-A. Aima is Greek for blood. Logic, Lojic. And that's a tip of the hat to my sister, Jill. So the J is for Jill. Aimalojic.com, and there's at least information enough to get a hold of us.
That's awesome.
Yeah, well, Jeff, listen, this has been a fascinating conversation. It sounds like you're going to be accelerating here pretty soon, which is great. So we'll have to have you maybe back on the show to give us an update in a year or so. But we always like to end the show the same way. So first question we've got for you is a book or something that you've watched, or a TED Talk, something that's inspired you along your path to kind of get to where you're at today.
I tell you, there is both a TED Talk and a book from the same lady, Barbara Natterson-Horowitz, and the name of the book is Zoobiquity, and it absolutely fascinating. She is a cardiologist who discovered the fact that veterinarians have been treating things for decades that on the human health side are still poorly understood. And so for her whole pitch basically is medical doctors, human medical doctors, need to be reaching out to veterinarians, because in a lot of cases they've already, they have therapies that can treat diseases that haven't made it to the human side yet. So I highly recommend it.
That's awesome. And then the other question that we usually ask, is there an innovator or another guest that you would recommend to be on this podcast?
My mentor in this whole thing has been Dr. Larry Cowgill at UC Davis. Absolutely a delightful human being, veterinary nephrologist and hemodialysis expert. He really pioneered hemodialysis and extracorporeal therapies in the veterinary space. 35 years ago, I think virtually every program in the world, every dialysis program in the world on the vet side has somehow stemmed directly or indirectly from him. Highly recommend it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinaryinnovationpodcast.com. See you next week.